Hey guys, tonight we're talking about a drug that eats its users alive. Literally. Skin turns green and scaly like reptile hide, then peels away to expose raw muscle. Bone becomes visible within weeks. Entire limbs rot off while the person still walks around injecting more. The smell announces them before they enter a room, rotting flesh mixed with industrial chemicals. Doctors in Russian emergency rooms learn to recognize Krokodil users instantly. Track marks surrounded by black necrotic tissue spreading like spilled ink. Average survival time after first injection: 1 to 2 years maximum. Some made it 3 months. The drug was named after a crocodile, either for the green scales it created or the chemical term buried in its synthesis. Both explanations fit perfectly. This is what happens when desperate people turn pharmacy medications into street drugs using gasoline, matchbox scrapings, and iodine. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. To understand Krokodil, you first need to understand that someone actually invented this compound on purpose, in a legitimate laboratory, for medical use. The year was 1932. The place was the University of Illinois. An American chemist named Lyndon Frederick Small was searching for a better painkiller than morphine. Small had a problem common to pharmaceutical researchers of that era. Morphine worked beautifully for pain but destroyed lives through addiction. His solution was to modify the morphine molecule slightly, creating what he called desomorphine. The new compound delivered pain relief 8 to 10 times stronger than morphine. Patients needed smaller doses, the high hit faster and harder. Small published his findings and moved on to other projects, probably feeling quite proud of his contribution to medical science. European pharmaceutical companies noticed Small's work. A Swiss firm called Roche began manufacturing desomorphine under the brand name Permanid during the 1930s and 1940s. Doctors prescribed it for severe pain, particularly in Switzerland and a few other countries. The medication worked exactly as advertised. Powerful, fast-acting, effective. Then physicians started noticing the problems. Patients developed tolerance incredibly quickly, needing higher doses within days. The addiction potential made morphine look tame by comparison. Someone using desomorphine medically for a broken bone could become physically dependent within a week. Withdrawal symptoms arrived with vicious intensity. Roche quietly discontinued Permanid by the 1950s. Most countries banned or severely restricted desomorphine. The compound disappeared from Western medicine almost entirely, remembered only in dusty pharmaceutical journals and chemical reference books. The molecule itself remained simple, almost elegant in its structure. Desomorphine differs from morphine by the removal of just one oxygen atom and the addition of 2 hydrogen atoms. This tiny change transforms how the drug binds to opioid receptors in the brain. Think of a lock and key, except this key slides in faster and grips harder than the original. The rush hits within seconds of injection. Euphoria floods the system. Pain vanishes completely. The user feels wrapped in warm cotton, separated from every harsh edge of reality. Duration proved to be the catch. The high lasted only 90 minutes to 2 hours compared to morphine's 6 to 8. This meant anyone using desomorphine needed to inject multiple times daily just to avoid withdrawal. The craving returned with savage speed. Small's synthesis method required sophisticated chemistry and pure ingredients. Pharmaceutical companies used equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Temperature control needed precision. Each step required monitoring. The pure desomorphine produced through proper synthesis was actually relatively safe when used medically, despite its addiction potential. Clean pharmaceutical desomorphine didn't destroy tissue or cause organ failure beyond normal opioid effects. The compound worked in the body, then metabolized and left. Doctors could manage it, though they chose not to because better alternatives existed. This pharmaceutical version bears almost no resemblance to what would emerge on Russian streets 70 years later. The transformation from laboratory curiosity to flesh-eating street drug required three key ingredients: economic desperation, pharmaceutical availability, and chemical ignorance. Russia, after the Soviet collapse, provided all three in abundance. But the specific chemistry matters here, because understanding the synthesis explains the horror. Desomorphine can be made from codeine through a relatively simple chemical process. Codeine, a much weaker opioid, exists in dozens of over-the-counter medications worldwide. Most countries restrict it carefully, but post-Soviet Russia sold codeine pills in pharmacies with minimal oversight through the 2000s. Any addict with basic chemistry knowledge could look up the synthesis pathway. Codeine to desomorphine requires iodine, red phosphorus, and a strong base. The legitimate laboratory process uses pure reagents and controlled conditions. Street synthesis uses whatever's available at the corner store. Red phosphorus gets scraped from matchbox strike pads. Iodine comes from pharmacy antiseptic solutions. The base might be drain cleaner or battery acid. Hydrochloric acid enters the mix for extraction. Gasoline or paint thinner serves as solvent. Users heat this toxic soup in glass bottles or metal pots, shake it violently, filter it through cloth, and inject the result directly into their veins. No purification, no testing, no removal of the chemical poisons swimming alongside the desomorphine. The cooking process takes 30 minutes to an hour using equipment found in any kitchen. What enters the bloodstream is barely desomorphine at all. The crude synthesis produces dozens of byproducts, each more toxic than the last. Chlorocodide, an intermediate compound, remains in the mixture. This chemical causes direct vascular damage. Heavy metals from the matchbox phosphorus accumulate in organs. Gasoline residue saturates fat tissue. Iodine burns blood vessels from the inside. Hydrochloric acid creates chemical burns in veins. The actual desomorphine content might be 30% of the liquid. The remaining 70% is industrial poison. Injecting this mixture is like mainlining drain cleaner that happens to get you high for 90 minutes. The body's response begins immediately. Blood vessels at the injection site collapse from chemical damage. Tissue surrounding the vein receives a concentrated dose of toxins that destroy cells on contact. The immune system attacks the damaged area, sending white blood cells that die trying to clean up the mess. Infection sets in almost immediately because the injection liquid is never sterile. It's cooked in dirty bottles using street chemicals. Bacteria flourish in the dead tissue. Within hours, the injection site becomes inflamed and discolored. Within days, the skin starts turning dark. The greenish tint appears as tissue dies and begins decomposing while still attached to the living body. Scales form as the top layers of skin necrotize and separate. The flesh beneath turns black, then grey, then simply falls away. Users inject multiple times daily because the high is so short. Each injection destroys another patch of tissue. The damage spreads outward from injection sites like cancer. Addicts rotate between arm veins, leg veins, neck veins, wherever they can find access. Every new injection point becomes another center of decay. The blood vessels themselves die, turning into hard cords of scar tissue. Eventually, no veins remain functional, forcing users to inject directly into muscle or under skin. This spreads the poison across wider areas. An arm injection might destroy tissue from wrist to shoulder within weeks. Leg injections lead to amputations. Facial injections expose skull bone. The internal damage proceeds just as viciously. Liver cells die trying to process the gasoline and solvents. Kidney filtration breaks down under the chemical assault, leading to uremia. The blood fills with waste products that should be eliminated. The immune system collapses from constant overwork fighting infections it cannot win. Bone marrow struggles to produce blood cells. Heart valves become infected with bacteria. Lungs fill with emboli, tiny clots of dead tissue that break off and travel through circulation. Brain tissue dies from toxic exposure and lack of oxygen when breathing becomes laboured. The body essentially rots from inside while the user keeps injecting to avoid withdrawal symptoms that feel like death itself. Withdrawal from desomorphine arrives within hours of the last dose. Muscles cramp so severely that bones can fracture. Vomiting continues until nothing remains in the stomach, then continues anyway. Diarrhea causes dangerous dehydration. Sweating soaks clothing despite chills that make teeth chatter. The psychological craving overwhelms any rational thought about consequences. An addict facing withdrawal will cook another batch regardless of the missing fingers or exposed bone in their forearm. The high is the only escape from both the physical agony and the mental horror of watching their own body decompose. This creates a closed loop of addiction more vicious than almost any other drug. Heroin users might recover. Krokodil users just die slower or faster, depending on injection frequency. The nickname Krokodil entered Russian slang sometime around 2003 to 2005 in Siberian cities, though pinpointing the exact origin is impossible. The green scaly skin provided the obvious connection. Users literally looked like they were transforming into reptiles, their skin cracking into plates of dead tissue. The chemical term alpha-chlorocodide, an intermediate in desomorphine synthesis, might have contributed to the name through street slang evolution. Whatever the etymology, the name spread faster than the drug itself through Russian addict communities and online forums. Medical professionals initially had no idea what they were seeing. Emergency room doctors in Irkutsk and Omsk encountered patients with tissue damage unlike anything in their textbooks. The necrosis patterns didn't match known infections or vascular diseases. Only when patients admitted injecting homemade drugs did the picture begin clarifying. Early medical reports from 2004 and 2005 described cases almost too extreme to believe. A 23-year-old male presented with his entire left forearm black and lifeless, bone visible through gaps in the skin. A 19-year-old female had her jaw exposed after facial injections destroyed the tissue around her mouth. A 30-year-old male required quadruple amputation, both legs below the knee, both arms below the elbow. These weren't rare cases scattered across years. Siberian hospitals started seeing multiple Krokodil admissions weekly, then daily. The pattern became unmistakable. Young addicts, extreme tissue necrosis, admission of injecting homemade desomorphine, death or amputation within weeks. Doctors could do almost nothing because the damage was too extensive and the patients kept using. The geographic origin in Siberia and Russia's Far East wasn't random. These regions sat at the end of the long supply chains for heroin from Afghanistan. When heroin prices spiked in the early 2000s, Siberian addicts felt the pinch first and hardest. They also had cold winters that limited outdoor drug activity and pushed experimentation indoors. The first underground chemists probably started cooking desomorphine as a cheap heroin substitute around 2002 or 2003. Word spread through prisons. Russia's penal system acted as a perfect networking hub for drug synthesis knowledge. Released prisoners brought the recipe back to their home cities. By 2005, Krokodil was being produced in dozens of Russian cities, primarily east of the Ural Mountains. The recipe required no special knowledge beyond basic instructions that fit on a single page. Any addict could become a cook. Any kitchen could become a laboratory. Any pharmacy selling codeine pills was enabling death by installment plan. The Soviet Union collapsed on December 26, 1991, and with it disappeared the Iron Curtain that had blocked drug trafficking routes for 70 years. Afghanistan's poppy fields exploded in production during the chaos of civil war. Heroin flooded northward through Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan into Russia's newly porous borders. Border guards who once shot smugglers on sight now negotiated prices. Customs officials accepted bribes that equaled 10 years of their official salaries. The infrastructure for interdiction simply evaporated as government budgets dried up and Soviet-era discipline collapsed into every man for himself capitalism. Russian cities had always harboured small populations of opiate users, mostly older individuals using medical preparations or homegrown poppy straw. The 1990s transformed this stable underground into an epidemic. Heroin arrived cheap and pure, marketed aggressively by organised crime networks that saw Russia as virgin territory. Young people experimented in numbers that overwhelmed any treatment capacity. Moscow and St. Petersburg became major consumption centres, but the addiction spread everywhere. Industrial cities facing factory closures, rural towns with vanishing job markets, Siberian outposts where winter darkness stretched for months. By 2000, conservative estimates placed Russia's heroin-addicted population at 2 million people. Others suggested 5 million or more. Nobody knew the real number because nobody was counting systematically. The economics of addiction created a vulnerable population primed for disaster. A heroin habit required approximately 1,500 to 2,000 rubles daily by the mid-2000s, roughly $50 to $70, an impossible sum for most Russian workers whose monthly salaries might total 10,000 rubles. Addicts stole, prostituted themselves, dealt drugs to support their use. Families sold possessions, apartments were lost. The desperation became normalized in affected communities. Then heroin prices began climbing sharply around 2003 and 2004. Afghan production faced pressure from NATO operations. Trafficking routes shifted. Purity dropped while prices increased. Russian addicts suddenly faced an impossible choice. Endure withdrawal that felt like dying. Find money that didn't exist, or locate an alternative. Russian pharmacy regulations inherited from the Soviet system allowed over-the-counter sales of medications containing codeine. The logic seemed reasonable. Codeine was a weak opioid used for moderate pain and cough suppression, far less dangerous than morphine or heroin. Medications like Nurofen Plus combined ibuprofen with codeine. Sedalgin, Pentalgin, and Solpadeine all contained codeine in various formulations. A box of 20 pills might cost 150 rubles, available without prescription at any pharmacy. Thousands of these medications sat on shelves across Russia, completely legal and accessible. Pharmacists sold them to anyone who asked. The oversight was minimal. Purchase limits were suggestions rather than enforced rules. Somewhere in Siberia, probably in multiple locations simultaneously, addicts facing heroin withdrawal began experimenting with codeine extraction and conversion. The chemistry wasn't secret. Pharmaceutical references described the desomorphine synthesis pathway in technical detail. Underground drug forums on the early Russian internet shared information freely. Prison networks passed along synthesis instructions like recipes for prison wine. The basic procedure was shockingly simple compared to synthesizing other drugs. Methamphetamine required pseudoephedrine restrictions and multi-step processes. MDMA needed precursor chemicals monitored by law enforcement. Desomorphine just needed codeine pills and household items. The recipe spread through Russian addict communities with viral speed during 2003 and 2004. Online forums like narcotics.ru and various dark web predecessors hosted detailed instructions. Users shared tips for improving yield, which pharmacy chains had the best codeine medications, how to avoid raising suspicion when buying multiple packages. The synthesis became standardized. Crush 60 to 100 codeine tablets into powder, add gasoline or paint thinner to extract the codeine, introduce iodine tincture from the pharmacy, scrape red phosphorus from 20 to 30 matchboxes, add the phosphorus to the mixture, shake vigorously while heating gently, filter through cloth or cotton, add hydrochloric acid or other strong acid to precipitate the desomorphine, extract the solids, dissolve in water, inject. Every step was crude, dangerous, and contaminated. Crushing pills released binders and fillers that remained in the final product. Gasoline added benzene and other carcinogens that concentrated during heating. Iodine solutions contained stabilizers and preservatives never meant for injection. Matchbox phosphorus included glue, cardboard fragments, and chemical coatings. The heating process generated toxic fumes, phosphine gas that could cause respiratory failure, iodine vapor that burned lungs. Filtering through dirty cloth removed only the largest particles while allowing bacteria and chemical contaminants free passage. The acid precipitation step created salts that damaged veins. Dissolving in tap water introduced microorganisms that would colonize dying tissue. Experienced drug cooks, those with chemistry backgrounds or years of methamphetamine production, understood the dangers and took minimal precautions. Most Krokodil users had no such knowledge. They followed instructions copied from internet forums onto notebook paper, working in bathrooms with the door locked or in kitchen corners while family members slept. The cooking process took anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours depending on technique. Glass bottles served as reaction vessels, heated over stove flames or with cigarette lighters. The mixture bubbled and changed colours, brown to black to reddish as the chemistry progressed. The smell was unmistakable. Chemical solvent mixed with iodine, sharp and nauseating. Neighbours in apartment buildings began recognising it, associating the odour with the young people who emerged looking progressively sicker. The name Krokodil emerged organically from user communities rather than through any official designation. Street drugs developed slang names through obscure processes, sometimes describing effects, sometimes referencing appearance, sometimes pure random association. The green scaly skin provided the obvious reptilian connection that made the name stick. Users in Irkutsk were calling it Krokodil by 2003. The term appeared in Omsk and Banal by 2004. Online forums adopted it universally by 2005. Medical professionals heard the name from patients but had no official recognition of what it meant. Toxicology reports listed unknown substance or homemade opioid because desomorphine wasn't on standard drug screening panels. Regional hospitals in Siberia started seeing patterns that alarmed infectious disease specialists and surgeons. Young patients arrived with soft tissue infections that didn't respond to standard antibiotic treatment. The infections weren't caused by typical bacteria found in injection drug users. Instead, mixed bacterial populations, including environmental organisms that normally couldn't establish infections, were flourishing in the necrotic tissue. Soil bacteria, waterborne pathogens, fungal infections, anything that contacted the injection site could colonize the dying flesh. The immune suppression from both the drug itself and the toxic chemicals made fighting infection impossible. Surgical intervention became the only option, but even amputation couldn't guarantee survival. A patient admitted with an infected arm might require amputation at the elbow, then at the shoulder as infection spread. Leg infections climbed past where surgeons could safely cut. facial tissue damage couldn't be amputated without leaving patients unable to eat or breathe. Even when surgery succeeded, the patient would leave the hospital and immediately resume using Krokodil because the addiction remained. Doctors watched patients return weeks later with new necrotic areas, having injected into the only remaining veins in their bodies. The futility crushed medical staff who entered healthcare to save lives, not watch young people decompose in hospital beds. The geographic spread followed drug trafficking patterns and economic desperation. Siberian cities hit hardest first: Irkutsk, Krasnoyarsk, Novosibirsk. These regions combined harsh climates, declining industries, high unemployment, and distance from Moscow's economic opportunities. Young people faced bleak futures even before drugs entered the equation. Heroin addiction offered escape until prices made it unaffordable. Krokodil provided the same escape at a fraction of the cost. By 2005, the problem was radiating westward along the Trans-Siberian Railway corridor. Every city with a pharmacy selling codeine and a population of heroin addicts became a potential outbreak site. Prison networks accelerated the spread because Russia's penal system concentrated addicts from different regions in the same facilities. An inmate from Vladivostok could share a cell with someone from Volgograd. They exchanged information, recipes, contacts. Released prisoners brought knowledge back to cities that hadn't yet encountered Krokodil. The synthesis instructions were simple enough to memorize. No written notes needed to survive prison searches. A single former inmate could establish Krokodil production in a new city within weeks of release. The exponential spread pattern resembled infectious disease more than typical drug proliferation. Online forums provided the other major transmission vector. Russian-language drug sites operated relatively openly in the mid-2000s, before authorities learned to monitor them effectively. Users posted detailed synthesis guides complete with photographs of each step. They shared tips for scaling up production to sell rather than just personal use. Discussion threads covered how to source bulk codeine, which pharmacies had lax oversight, techniques for extracting more phosphorus from matches. The forums also documented the damage, users posting photographs of their injuries, asking for advice about infections, sharing stories of friends who had died. Yet the warnings went unheeded because addiction doesn't respond to rational information about consequences. The age demographic showed disturbing patterns. Most Krokodil users range from 16 to 35 years old. Teenagers experimented because they lacked money for heroin and found the chemistry exciting. Young adults in their 20s formed the core user group, old enough to have developed serious heroin addiction, young enough to lack resources for maintaining expensive habits. Users over 40 were rare because they either had stable heroin connections or had died from decades of hard living. The drug was creating a lost generation of young Russians who wouldn't survive to middle age. Family destruction followed predictable patterns. Parents discovered children's addiction through smell, visible wounds, or finding cooking equipment. Initial responses range from denial to rage to desperate attempts at intervention. Russian addiction treatment in the 2000s was primitive, mostly consisting of detoxification in psychiatric hospitals, followed by release with no follow-up support. The 12-step groups that helped Western addicts barely existed. Methadone maintenance was illegal. Buprenorphine wasn't available. Families had no resources beyond locking users in rooms to force withdrawal, which only delayed the inevitable return to use. Parents watched children deteriorate week by week, unable to stop the process. The cooking process itself created community hazards beyond individual users. Apartment buildings in affected areas became involuntary chemistry labs. Phosphine gas from botched synthesis killed people in adjacent apartments. Fires from heating volatile solvents spread to neighboring units. Children in families that cooked Krokodil inhaled toxic fumes daily. suffering developmental damage. The contaminated waste, bottles containing chemical residue, used filters, discarded plant material, was dumped in hallway trash bins or outdoor areas where it leached into soil and water. Entire neighborhoods became toxic zones, though residents rarely connected health problems to nearby drug production. By 2006, Krokodil had established itself as a fixture of Russian drug culture in affected regions. Users recognized each other on the street by wounds and gait. The necrosis caused limping or arm immobility that marked them clearly. Pharmacies began noticing patterns of young people buying maximum quantities of codeine medications daily. Some pharmacists started refusing sales, recognizing the warning signs. Others continued selling because profits mattered more than consequences, or because they convinced themselves they weren't responsible for what customers did with legal products. The pharmaceutical industry had no incentive to push for restrictions because codeine medications generated substantial revenue. Law enforcement remained largely unaware or unconcerned during these early years. Police focused on heroin trafficking and methamphetamine labs, both of which involved international crime networks worth pursuing. Krokodil was a local phenomenon affecting marginalized populations. Arrests for possession or production were rare because the drug wasn't on priority lists. When police did encounter it, they often lacked knowledge about what they were seeing. The synthesis equipment looked like trash rather than drug paraphernalia. The final product appeared as dirty water rather than recognizable drugs. Even when arrests occurred, prosecutors struggled to charge users under existing statutes because desomorphine occupied a legal grey area, technically illegal, but not specifically scheduled like heroin. The medical literature remained almost silent about Krokodil through 2007. Regional doctors in Siberia saw the cases, but lacked platforms to broadcast warnings nationally. International medical journals had no interest in obscure Russian drug problems. The few published case reports appeared in Russian-language regional medical bulletins that nobody outside Siberia read. This information gap meant that when Krokodil began appearing in Moscow and Western Russia, doctors there were completely unprepared. They misdiagnosed the tissue damage as necrotizing fasciitis from normal bacterial infections and wondered why treatments failed. Only after patients admitted using homemade drugs did the connection become clear. By then, the window for early intervention had closed. The epidemic was already unstoppable. The first injection delivered euphoria identical to high-grade heroin within 15 seconds. Users described warmth spreading from the injection site throughout their entire body, erasing pain, anxiety, and consciousness of their surroundings. The rush hit harder than morphine because desomorphine crossed the blood-brain barrier faster and bound to opioid receptors with greater affinity. Every neuron in the reward pathway fired simultaneously. Dopamine flooded synapses. The user experienced what brain scans would later show as complete activation of pleasure centers normally reserved for survival activities like eating or sex. This initial high represented the last genuinely good moment in a Krokodil user's life. The come down began within 90 minutes as the drug metabolized and cleared from the system. Unlike heroin's gentle descent over 6 to 8 hours, desomorphine withdrawal announced itself with violent immediacy. Muscle aches started first, progressing to cramps within minutes. Nausea followed, then cold sweats despite normal room temperature. The psychological craving arrived with crushing force, an overwhelming compulsion to inject again that eliminated rational thought. Users felt this sequence after their very first dose because desomorphine's pharmacological profile created dependency faster than virtually any other opioid. The receptor binding was so tight that the brain adapted instantly, recalibrating normal function around the drug's presence. Physical damage from the toxic synthesis byproducts began before withdrawal even started. The injection site received a concentrated dose of gasoline, iodine compounds, phosphorus particles, and bacterial contamination. Blood vessel walls absorbed these chemicals directly, suffering immediate injury to endothelial cells that line the interior. The immune system recognized the damage and dispatched white blood cells to the area. Under normal circumstances, this inflammatory response would heal the injury over several days. With Krokodil, the toxic load overwhelmed the healing process entirely. Each subsequent injection, occurring every 2 to 3 hours, added more poison to tissue already struggling to survive. The visible skin changes appeared within 24 to 48 hours of the first injection in most users. The area around the injection site became red and swollen from inflammation. Bruising developed as small blood vessels ruptured from chemical damage. The skin took on a greyish tint as circulation decreased and tissue began dying. By the 3rd or 4th day of regular use, the discoloration deepened to dark purple or black. The epidermis, the outermost skin layer, started separating from underlying tissue. Users could press on these areas and feel the skin slide loosely over damaged muscle, disconnected from its blood supply. The texture changed from normal flesh to something resembling leather left in rain. Scales formed as the dying epidermis dried and cracked into irregular plates. These weren't like dandruff or dry skin that flakes away harmlessly. The scales were thick sections of dead tissue still partially attached to living flesh beneath. They ranged in size from coin-sized patches to areas covering entire forearms. The colour progressed through a spectrum that gave the drug its reptilian nickname: yellow-green from iodine accumulation, grey-green from tissue death, dark green from bacterial colonization, finally black as complete necrosis set in. Peeling away a scale revealed raw muscle tissue underneath, often already infected with multiple bacterial species. The exposed areas oozed serum and pus constantly, attracting flies in warmer months. The tissue death wasn't limited to skin and surface layers. Krokodil's toxic mixture travelled through the bloodstream from the injection site, causing damage wherever it lodged. Muscle tissue near injection points became necrotic and liquefied, creating abscesses filled with dead cells and bacteria. These pockets of infection could be tennis ball sized within a week. Surgically draining them provided only temporary relief because the user would inject again within hours, starting the cycle anew. The muscle damage was permanent. Even if someone survived and stopped using, the destroyed tissue never regenerated, leaving permanent weakness and deformity. Blood vessels throughout the body suffered catastrophic damage that created cascading failures in multiple organ systems. Veins used for injection collapsed entirely within days, forcing users to find new sites. Arms gave out first, then legs, then the neck, then anywhere a vein could be accessed. The vein collapse wasn't like the scarring seen in long-term heroin users, which might take years to develop. Krokodil destroyed veins completely in weeks. The vessel walls turned into hard fibrous cords that couldn't carry blood. The body attempted to route circulation around these dead zones, but couldn't compensate fast enough. Tissue downstream from collapsed veins became starved for oxygen and died even without direct toxic exposure. Bone infections represented one of the most devastating complications, because they were essentially untreatable in active users. Osteomyelitis, bacterial infection of bone tissue, occurred when the toxic mixture or contaminated injection equipment introduced bacteria directly into bones, or when soft tissue infections spread deeper. The long bones of arms and legs were most commonly affected, but skull, jaw, and vertebral infections also occurred. Bacteria colonized the bone marrow and began destroying the mineralized tissue from inside. The infected bone became brittle and prone to fracture. Treating osteomyelitis requires weeks of intravenous antibiotics and often surgical removal of dead bone, neither of which worked when patients kept injecting contaminated drugs. The jaw infections were particularly horrific because they destroyed facial structure while remaining partially visible. Users who injected into neck veins or facial vessels developed necrosis that exposed the mandible or maxilla within weeks. The jawbone became infected, turned black, and literally rotted away while the person remained alive. Teeth fell out as the bone supporting them dissolved. The lower face collapsed inward, making eating impossible and breathing difficult. Some users had to be fed through tubes while their faces decomposed around the feeding apparatus. Surgical reconstruction was pointless because continued drug use prevented healing. Doctors could only provide pain management and watch the deterioration continue. Internal organ damage accumulated silently while the visible destruction captured attention. The liver, responsible for metabolizing every substance that enters the bloodstream, was bombarded with chemicals it had no evolutionary preparation to handle. Gasoline compounds, iodine, phosphorus derivatives. The liver cells attempted to break down each poison, dying in the process. Hepatocytes couldn't regenerate fast enough to replace the losses. Liver function tests in Krokodil users showed enzyme levels 10 to 20 times normal, indicating massive ongoing cell death. Jaundice developed as bilirubin accumulated. The abdomen swelled with fluid as portal hypertension set in. Liver failure progressed toward inevitability. Kidney function collapsed under similar assault. The nephrons, microscopic filtering units that clean blood and produce urine, became clogged with toxic debris and dead cells. The delicate capillary networks that perform filtration were destroyed by circulating poisons. Kidney function declined measurably with each passing week of use. Creatinine levels rose as the kidneys failed to clear waste products. Uremia developed. The blood filled with urea and other compounds that should be eliminated. This caused confusion, seizures, and progressive brain damage on top of the direct neurological effects of the drug. Dialysis could support failing kidneys temporarily, but continued drug use made the treatment futile. Users died of kidney failure within months while still actively injecting. The immune system faced impossible demands that led to total collapse. Every injection site became infected with multiple bacterial species, including organisms that normally couldn't establish infections in healthy people. The immune response mobilized constantly, depleting reserves of white blood cells. The bone marrow struggled to produce replacement immune cells while simultaneously damaged by circulating toxins. Opportunistic infections appeared. Fungal infections in the lungs, viral reactivations, tuberculosis, pneumonia. Users developed fevers that never fully resolved. Their bodies fought dozens of infections simultaneously, while the source of contamination continued with each new injection. Bloodborne infections spread through shared needles and cooking equipment used by multiple people. Hepatitis C transmission was nearly universal among Krokodil users because the virus survived in contaminated injection equipment. HIV spread rapidly in communities where Krokodil use was common, though less efficiently than hepatitis due to the virus's fragility outside the body. Users were often too sick from tissue destruction to notice symptoms of these chronic infections until they were far advanced. Testing and treatment for blood-borne viruses was rarely available in the chaos of managing acute life-threatening complications from tissue necrosis. The cardiovascular system suffered damage that killed users even when they somehow avoided the worst tissue destruction. Particulate matter from poorly filtered Krokodil, tiny fragments of phosphorus, undissolved pill binders, bacteria clumps, travelled through veins to the heart and lungs. In the heart, these particles could lodge in valve tissue, causing endocarditis. The heart valves became inflamed and infected, developing vegetations, masses of bacteria, blood cells, and debris that interfered with normal valve function. Pieces of these vegetations would break off and travel to the brain, causing strokes. The lungs received a constant shower of particulates that lodged in small blood vessels, creating areas of dead lung tissue and pulmonary hypertension. Brain damage occurred through multiple mechanisms working simultaneously. Direct toxic effects from chemicals crossing the blood-brain barrier killed neurons. Lack of oxygen from respiratory depression during the drug's peak effect caused hypoxic brain injury. Septic emboli from infected heart valves lodged in brain blood vessels, causing small strokes scattered throughout the cerebral tissue. The cumulative effect was progressive cognitive decline that became noticeable within months. Users showed memory problems, difficulty concentrating, impaired judgment beyond what addiction alone would cause. Neurological examinations revealed abnormal reflexes and coordination problems. Brain imaging, when performed, showed multiple areas of dead tissue and general atrophy. The pain from tissue destruction was constant and severe, despite the opioid effects of the drug itself. Necrotic tissue generated inflammatory signals that bombarded pain receptors 24 hours daily. Exposed nerve endings in wounds sent distress signals continuously. The infection produced its own pain through pressure and tissue damage. Users existed in a paradox, taking an extremely powerful painkiller that simultaneously caused agony, requiring even more painkiller. The only escape from pain was to maintain constant intoxication, which meant injecting every few hours around the clock. Sleep became impossible except in brief periods of unconsciousness after injection. The exhaustion compounded every other health problem. Nutritional collapse accelerated physical deterioration because users couldn't or wouldn't eat. The nausea from constant intoxication and withdrawal suppressed appetite. Mouth and throat infections made swallowing painful. The mental obsession with obtaining and using drugs eliminated interest in food. Weight loss was dramatic, 20 to 40 pounds in the first few months, continuing until users became skeletal. The body consumed its own muscle tissue for energy, weakening everything further. Vitamin deficiencies caused additional neurological problems. The malnourishment impaired immune function and wound healing, creating more opportunities for infection. Users caught in this cycle often weighed less than 90 pounds when they died. The smell of Krokodil users became their most recognizable feature in affected communities. Rotting flesh produces putrescine and cadaverine, chemical compounds that give decomposition its characteristic odor. Living users smelled like corpses because portions of their bodies were literally decomposing. The chemical odors from the drug synthesis added layers of gasoline and iodine scents that clung to clothing and skin. The infected wounds oozed material that smelled of different bacterial species, each contributing its own notes to the symphony of decay. People could identify Krokodil users from across a room or down a hallway by scent alone. The smell was so distinctive and horrible that users became socially isolated beyond what typical addiction caused. Medical treatment options were severely limited even when users sought help. Antibiotics could fight some infections but not the ongoing contamination from continued use. Surgery could remove dead tissue but not prevent new necrosis from the next injection. Detoxification could break physical dependence temporarily, but not address the psychological addiction. Russia's healthcare system in the 2000s lacked resources for comprehensive addiction treatment, even for patients who wanted it. Most hospitals refused to admit Krokodil users, except in immediately life-threatening situations, because the cases were too complex, too expensive, and too hopeless. Users were told to stop using given minimal treatment and discharged to die elsewhere. The mortality rate was difficult to calculate precisely because many users died outside medical settings and weren't autopsied. Conservative estimates suggested that 50% of Krokodil users died within 1 year of starting use. Some sources claim the figure was closer to 70 or 80%. Virtually no one who used regularly survived beyond 2 years. The causes of death varied: sepsis from overwhelming infection, respiratory failure from pneumonia or pulmonary emboli, cardiac arrest from endocarditis, kidney failure, liver failure, stroke, or simply bleeding to death from eroded blood vessels. Many users committed suicide when the pain and disfigurement became unbearable. The bodies often showed such extensive damage that pathologists couldn't determine which specific organ failure ultimately caused death, because everything was simultaneously failing. The year 2009 marked the transition from regional problem to national catastrophe. Krokodil use had been climbing steadily across Siberia and the Urals for 6 years, but suddenly the exponential growth curve went vertical. Moscow began seeing cases in significant numbers for the first time. St. Petersburg emergency rooms admitted patients with tissue necrosis they'd only read about in forwarded medical reports from Eastern colleagues. Cities across central Russia, Nizhny Novgorod, Kazan, Samara, Voronezh, reported outbreaks simultaneously. The geographic containment had failed completely. The drug was now everywhere. Estimating the total number of users became a futile exercise in guesswork because Krokodil existed entirely in the underground economy. Russian government agencies responsible for drug policy tracking had virtually no surveillance systems in place for homemade synthetics. The Federal Drug Control Service published figures suggesting 100,000 active users nationally by 2010, but addiction specialists dismissed this as absurdly conservative. Regional health departments in Siberia alone were treating that many cases. Independent researchers examining hospital admission data, morgue records, and pharmacy codeine sales extrapolated figures ranging from 500,000 to over 2 million users. The true number remained unknown and unknowable, but clearly represented a significant fraction of Russia's existing opioid-addicted population. The surge in use had clear economic drivers. Global heroin prices spiked sharply in 2009 and 2010 as Afghan production faced disruptions from NATO operations and drought. Russian street prices for heroin doubled in some cities, tripled in others. A daily habit that cost 1,500 rubles in 2008 might require 3,000 or 4,000 rubles by 2010, completely impossible for most addicts. Meanwhile, Krokodil production costs remained stable at 100 to 300 rubles per dose because the ingredients were domestically available. The price differential created irresistible pressure for heroin users to switch. Even those who knew Krokodil's dangers made the calculation: slow death from Krokodil versus immediate agony of withdrawal. Addiction made the choice simple. Pharmacy sales data revealed the explosion in raw material sourcing. Chain pharmacies reported that codeine-containing medications had become their fastest-selling product category in many regions by 2010. Individual locations were selling hundreds of boxes of Nurofen Plus and similar products daily. Young people appeared at opening time, bought the maximum quantity allowed, then moved to the next pharmacy down the street. Some areas saw pharmacy shopping routes develop, coordinated groups hitting every location in a neighborhood to accumulate the thousands of pills needed for large-scale cooking. Pharmacists who tried to restrict sales faced threats or simply lost business to competitors willing to sell without questions. The production scaled up from individual users cooking personal doses to organized operations supplying networks of customers. Entrepreneurs recognized the profit potential in bulk synthesis. Apartments were converted into cooking labs running 24 hours daily with shifts of workers. The equipment became more sophisticated, multiple reaction vessels allowing parallel processing, improvised filtration systems, better temperature control. The largest operations could produce hundreds of doses daily. generating enormous profits given the minimal ingredient costs. These labs employed runners to collect codeine from pharmacies, chemists to oversee synthesis, dealers to distribute the product, and enforcers to protect the territory. Violence followed the money as it always does in drug markets. Competing production groups fought over pharmacy access and customer bases. Dealers who sold in the wrong neighborhood got beaten or killed. Robberies targeted known users because even desperately sick addicts might have drugs or cash. The violence lacked the organized structure of traditional Russian crime syndicates. Krokodil operations were too small-scale and scattered. Instead, the bloodshed resembled gang warfare, with low-level criminals establishing temporary dominance through brutality before being displaced by the next group. Police barely responded because these weren't the sophisticated networks worth investigating. Just desperate people killing each other over a drug that was killing them anyway. Community impact extended far beyond users themselves as entire neighborhoods became production zones. Apartment buildings in poor districts might house 5 or 10 active cooking operations in different units. The chemical fumes permeated hallways and adjacent apartments, causing respiratory problems in residents who weren't even aware of the source. Children living in these buildings suffered chronic exposure to toxic vapors that affected development and caused persistent health issues. The fire risk was constant. Volatile solvents heated with open flames in cramped spaces led to explosions and fires that killed innocent neighbors. Property values in affected areas collapsed as buildings gained reputations as drug production sites. The demographics of use shifted as the epidemic grew. Early adopters had been existing heroin addicts switching to a cheaper alternative. The expanding user base included younger experimenters who started directly with Krokodil because heroin was too expensive or unavailable. Teenagers as young as 14 were cooking and injecting, often in groups where peer pressure and collective denial about consequences accelerated initiation. Rural areas saw use spread as the simple synthesis required no urban infrastructure. Only a pharmacy selling codeine and internet access to learn the recipe. Geographic isolation actually facilitated use in some regions because law enforcement presence was minimal and community oversight broke down. Gender patterns showed rough equivalence between male and female users, unusual for injectable drugs, which typically skewed heavily male. Women faced additional consequences from Krokodil use, including nearly universal reproductive system damage. The toxic chemicals concentrated in ovarian and uterine tissue, causing permanent infertility within months. Pregnant users invariably miscarried or delivered severely damaged infants if pregnancy somehow progressed to term. The babies born to Krokodil-using mothers showed catastrophic birth defects, missing limbs, exposed organs, neurological devastation. Most died within hours. The few who survived required intensive care that Russian regional hospitals couldn't provide. Maternal mortality during pregnancy was extremely high, as the physiological stress overwhelmed already damaged organs. Social services and child protection agencies encountered impossible situations, as Krokodil use destroyed family structures. Children were abandoned when parents became too sick to care for them or died from the drug. Orphanages overflowed with children removed from homes where parents were actively using. Extended family members, grandparents, aunts, uncles took in children when they could, but often lacked resources to provide adequate care. The number of street children increased in affected cities as family dissolution created a population of minors with nowhere to go. Many of these children eventually began using Krokodil themselves, creating an intergenerational cycle of addiction and death. Medical systems in Russian regions buckled under caseloads they couldn't manage. Regional hospitals that might normally handle 2 or 3 complex infectious disease cases monthly were suddenly admitting 5 to 10 Krokodil users daily. Each patient required weeks of intensive care, multiple surgeries to remove dead tissue, prolonged antibiotic therapy, pain management, treatment for organ failure. The costs were staggering, easily exceeding 500,000 rubles per patient, money that underfunded regional health budgets didn't have. Hospitals responded by restricting admission, setting policies that denied beds to active drug users, creating de facto death sentences for people seeking help. The physicians and nurses treating Krokodil cases suffered psychological trauma from exposure to suffering they couldn't alleviate. Surgeons amputated limbs from 20-year-olds who would return weeks later, needing another amputation on the remaining limb. Infectious disease specialists watched patients deteriorate despite maximal treatment because continued drug use undermined every intervention. Emergency room staff became hardened to horrors that would have shocked them years earlier. Exposed bones, rotting facial tissue, wounds full of maggots became routine sights. The burnout rate among medical personnel in affected regions was extreme. Many experienced doctors transferred to other specialties or left medicine entirely rather than continue the futile battle. Morgue capacity became insufficient in cities with heavy Krokodil use. Bodies of users who died at home or on the street were brought to municipal morgues for processing, but the decomposition from Krokodil use made standard autopsy procedures nearly impossible. The tissue damage was so extensive that determining cause of death required specialized examination beyond most facilities' capabilities. Morgues designed to handle perhaps 5 bodies daily were receiving 20 or 30, many in advanced states of decay. Refrigeration units overflowed. Bodies were stored in hallways or temporary facilities. The morgue workers, like the hospital staff, became psychologically traumatized by the scale of death they processed. Public awareness of Krokodil remained limited despite the epidemic's scope, because users were marginalized and their deaths unreported. Mainstream Russian media initially ignored the problem or relegated it to brief crime reports. Families affected by Krokodil addiction rarely spoke publicly due to shame and stigma. The phenomenon was an open secret in affected communities. Everyone knew Krokodil was destroying neighborhoods, but remained invisible nationally. This information gap prevented any coordinated response and allowed the epidemic to grow unchecked. The few journalists who investigated the story struggled to find outlets willing to publish material considered too disturbing or too sympathetic to drug users. The international attention that eventually materialized came from Western media, discovering Krokodil as a shocking curiosity rather than a public health crisis. A few photographs of users with extreme tissue damage circulated online around 2010, generating horror and fascination. The images were genuinely shocking: green scaly skin, exposed bones, faces half destroyed, and went viral on early social media platforms. Western media outlets began investigating, sending photographers and journalists to Russian cities to document the phenomenon. The coverage was often sensationalistic, focusing on the most extreme cases and treating users as freakish cautionary tales rather than people suffering from addiction and medical disaster. The Vice documentary and photo essay published in 2013 brought Krokodil to wide international awareness. The images were unflinching: users injecting into neck veins, massive necrotic wounds, amputees shooting up between their toes as their only remaining injection site. The video interviews showed young people barely coherent, their bodies decomposing while they spoke about being unable to stop. The documentary went viral, attracting millions of views and generating widespread media coverage. The shock value obscured the actual public health story, but it did force Russian authorities to acknowledge a problem they'd been ignoring for nearly a decade. Russian government response to the international attention was defensive and inadequate, Official statements minimize the scope of the problem, suggesting Western media was exaggerating for sensationalism. The numbers of affected users were disputed, with government figures remaining far below independent estimates. The framing of Krokodil as primarily a criminal justice issue rather than a health crisis prevented allocation of medical resources that might have helped. Law enforcement received directives to crack down on production and sales, but the arrests barely dented the epidemic because new cooks immediately replaced those imprisoned. The fundamental drivers, cheap ingredients, economic desperation, untreated addiction, remained completely unaddressed. The pattern of use began showing signs of geographic clustering that created concentrated zones of devastation. Certain neighborhoods in affected cities developed reputations as Krokodil zones, where the drug dominated local culture. Street corners became known dealing locations. Abandoned buildings served as injection sites where users gathered in groups. These areas experienced complete social breakdown. Property crimes soared as users stole anything sellable. Prostitution proliferated as users traded sex for drugs. Basic municipal services broke down as workers refused to enter dangerous areas. The concentrated poverty and addiction created feedback loops where each problem worsened the others, making escape impossible for residents trapped in these zones. Schools in affected neighborhoods struggled with student populations that included children actively using Krokodil or deeply affected by family addiction. Teachers reported students with visible track marks and necrotic tissue attending classes sporadically between binges. Academic performance collapsed in schools serving these areas. Attendance rates plummeted as addiction disrupted family routines, and students saw no future worth preparing for. The long-term social costs were incalculable, an entire generation losing educational opportunities and life prospects before reaching adulthood. The affected children who survived to adulthood would carry physical, psychological, and educational damage that would limit them for decades. The peak of the epidemic around 2011 and 2012 represented a crisis that killed tens of thousands of Russians annually, while the government remained effectively paralyzed. Every element needed for effective response, treatment capacity, harm reduction programs, pharmaceutical regulation, social services, was absent or inadequate. Users who wanted to quit had nowhere to turn. Families seeking help for addicted members found no resources. Communities being destroyed by the drug received no assistance. The epidemic simply had to burn itself out through death and exhaustion of the susceptible population. The human cost was catastrophic and entirely preventable, but prevention would have required political will and public health infrastructure that didn't exist. The Russian government's first meaningful action came in June 2012, when the Ministry of Health issued new regulations restricting over-the-counter codeine sales. Medications containing codeine would now require prescriptions from licensed physicians. The policy seemed straightforward: eliminate easy access to the key ingredient and the Krokodil epidemic would collapse. Implementation revealed how little policymakers understood the addiction economy they were attempting to control. The regulations took effect on a scheduled date announced weeks in advance, giving every Krokodil cook in Russia time to stockpile massive quantities of codeine before restrictions began. Pharmacies experienced panic buying in the weeks before the new rules. Lines formed outside drugstores at opening, with the same faces appearing daily to purchase maximum quantities. Some individuals bought hundreds of boxes of codeine medications in single transactions, spending thousands of rubles to build reserves. Pharmacy chains initially welcomed the surge in sales before the restrictions killed a profitable product line. The stockpiling meant that when prescription requirements finally took effect, the impact was delayed by months as accumulated supplies worked through the system. Users who'd never planned ahead in their lives suddenly demonstrated impressive logistical skills in hoarding raw materials. The prescription requirement itself proved porous because Russian medical licensing and oversight had substantial gaps. Corrupt doctors sold prescriptions for a few hundred rubles, no examination required. Some physicians sympathetic to addicts viewed prescriptions as harm reduction. Better to provide legal codeine than force patients toward more dangerous alternatives. Clinics in poor neighborhoods became known sources for codeine prescriptions with minimal questions asked. Drug-seeking patients learned which doctors would cooperate and shared this information through user networks. The prescription requirement added a step and some expense to the acquisition process, but didn't create an impenetrable barrier. Cross-border smuggling filled remaining gaps in domestic supply. Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and other former Soviet states maintained looser pharmaceutical regulations through 2012 and 2013. Enterprising smugglers bought codeine medications legally in these countries and transported them to Russia for resale at significant markups. The borders were porous, and corruption among customs officials made interdiction sporadic at best. A car trunk could hold thousands of pills worth tens of thousands of rubles on the Russian black market. The risk-reward calculation made smuggling irresistible for people in border regions with few economic opportunities. Underground chemists adapted their synthesis methods to extract codeine from medications designed to prevent abuse. Pharmaceutical companies had developed extended-release formulations with abuse-deterrent properties, pills that turned to gel when crushed or dissolved, making extraction theoretically difficult. The chemists defeated these protections through trial and error, freezing the pills, then crushing them while frozen bypassed gel formation. Extended soaking in specific solvents separated the active ingredients from blocking agents. Every pharmaceutical countermeasure generated user innovation within weeks. The cat-and-mouse game between drug designers and street chemists always favoured the chemists because they could experiment faster than regulatory approval processes moved. Regional variations in enforcement created internal smuggling routes within Russia itself. Some areas strictly enforced the prescription requirements, while others maintained lax oversight. Users and dealers mapped these regulatory variations and exploited them ruthlessly. A person living in Moscow, where enforcement was relatively strict, could travel to a smaller city 200 kilometers away, visit multiple pharmacies using false identification, and return with sufficient codeine for weeks of production. The decentralized nature of Russian pharmaceutical regulation meant that federal policies translated into wildly different local realities. Law enforcement efforts focused on arresting producers and dealers rather than addressing demand or providing treatment alternatives. Police raids on suspected cooking operations increased dramatically in 2012 and 2013. Tactical units would storm apartments, finding reaction vessels, chemicals, and finished product. The arrests made impressive statistics for official reports. Thousands of busts, kilograms of drugs seized, years of prison sentences handed down. The impact on actual availability was negligible because new cooks emerged immediately to fill any gap. The arrested individuals were overwhelmingly low-level operators who could be replaced instantly from the pool of users willing to cook for personal supply plus modest profits. Prison sentences for Krokodil production were harsh under Russian drug laws, often ranging from 8 to 15 years. The courts treated Desomorphine synthesis as seriously as heroin trafficking despite the fundamental differences. Krokodil was overwhelmingly produced for local consumption rather than sophisticated criminal networks. The harsh sentences had no deterrent effect because desperate addicts don't calculate legal risks rationally. Someone facing immediate withdrawal symptoms would cook Krokodil regardless of potential prison time. The prison population swelled with convicted Krokodil cooks serving long sentences while accomplishing nothing toward reducing use. Prisons themselves became vectors for spreading Krokodil knowledge as convicted users and producers shared cells. The institutional environment concentrated drug expertise, allowing experienced chemists to train newcomers in synthesis techniques. Upon release, these newly educated individuals brought refined production methods back to their communities. The unintended consequence of mass incarceration was creating a trained workforce of Krokodil cooks who'd learned best practices during their sentences. Russian prisons had always functioned as criminal universities, and Krokodil production became part of the curriculum. Treatment capacity remained woefully inadequate even as government rhetoric acknowledged the epidemic. Russia's addiction treatment system was built around forced detoxification in psychiatric institutions, essentially medical imprisonment until acute withdrawal passed, followed by release with no continuing support. Methadone maintenance was illegal, based on the logic that replacing one opioid with another wasn't real treatment. Buprenorphine wasn't widely available. Counseling and social support services barely existed. The system was designed for punishment and deterrence, rather than actually helping people recover from addiction. The few specialized clinics that attempted comprehensive treatment faced impossible obstacles. Krokodil users required extensive medical care for tissue damage, infections, and organ failure before addiction treatment could even begin. Many needed amputations, skin grafts, prolonged antibiotic courses, pain management, all expensive and complex. After stabilizing physically, patients needed months of psychological support to address the addiction itself. Insurance coverage was inadequate or non-existent for this level of care. Most clinics couldn't afford to accept Krokodil patients given the costs involved. Users who genuinely wanted help found themselves turned away from facilities that lacked resources to treat them. Harm reduction programs that might have prevented some damage faced ideological opposition from government officials who viewed them as enabling drug use. Needle exchange programs existed in limited form in some Russian cities, but were chronically underfunded and restricted by regulations. The concept of providing clean injection supplies to prevent infections was controversial, despite overwhelming evidence of effectiveness. Distributing information about safer injection practices or drug purity testing was considered promoting drug use. The result was that Krokodil users had no access to basic harm reduction tools that might have prevented some of the worst medical consequences. Pharmaceutical industry lobbying complicated regulatory efforts throughout the crisis. Companies manufacturing codeine medications generated substantial revenue from these products and resisted efforts to restrict them. Industry representatives argued that legitimate pain patients would suffer if access to codeine became too difficult. They commissioned studies claiming that most codeine sales were for appropriate medical use, and that restricting availability would harm public health. The lobbying was effective enough that even after the 2012 prescription requirements, enforcement remained inconsistent and loopholes persisted. Profits took precedence over preventing an epidemic killing tens of thousands. Economic factors underlying the epidemic remained completely unaddressed by government policy. The regional unemployment, poverty, and social collapse that drove people toward drugs in the first place continued unchanged. Young people in devastated industrial cities still faced futures without prospects. The despair and hopelessness that made Krokodil's brief escape attractive persisted. Without economic development, job creation, or social support systems, any success in restricting one drug would simply redirect demand toward the next available substance. The cycle would continue indefinitely because the fundamental causes went untreated. Public health campaigns attempted to raise awareness about Krokodil's dangers, but struggled with messaging that would resonate with the target audience. Posters showing graphic images of tissue damage and warnings about death were placed in schools and community centres. The campaigns assumed that information about consequences would deter use, ignoring the reality that addicts already knew the risks and used anyway. Addiction doesn't respond to rational risk assessment. Someone in withdrawal doesn't care about potential death in 6 months when they're suffering unbearably right now. The awareness campaigns made policymakers feel they'd done something while accomplishing almost nothing toward reducing use. Medical education efforts had more practical impact by training healthcare workers to recognize and treat Krokodil-related complications. Regional conferences brought together doctors from affected areas to share treatment protocols. Published case studies in Russian medical journals documented what interventions worked and which failed. Surgeons developed specialized techniques for debriding necrotic tissue and managing the massive wounds Krokodil created. Infectious disease specialists identified the unusual bacterial populations colonizing injection sites and determined appropriate antibiotic regimens. This knowledge sharing improved outcomes for users who did receive treatment, even if the number reaching medical care remained far too small. International cooperation on drug policy could have provided resources and expertise Russia needed, but nationalism and defensiveness prevented meaningful collaboration. International organizations offered assistance with treatment program development and harm reduction implementation. Foreign addiction specialists proposed evidence-based approaches that had worked elsewhere. The Russian government largely rejected these offers, viewing them as Western interference and criticism of Russian policy failures. Pride prevented accepting help that might have saved lives. The epidemic remained primarily a Russian problem that Russia insisted on handling alone, with predictably poor results. Media coverage evolved from complete silence to sensationalism, to occasionally thoughtful reporting on the underlying issues. Russian journalists who investigated thoroughly produced powerful stories about families destroyed, communities ravaged, and government failure to respond. These reports appeared in smaller publications and online outlets, rather than state-controlled media. The coverage humanized users as people suffering from disease rather than simply criminals deserving punishment. Some stories prompted local officials to action, leading to targeted interventions in specific communities. The impact was limited but demonstrated that awareness could sometimes generate political will for change. Regional governments varied dramatically in their responses based on local political priorities and resource availability. Some areas implemented coordinated strategies combining law enforcement, treatment expansion, and community support. Others did essentially nothing beyond token enforcement efforts. The cities and regions with the most effective responses shared certain characteristics: leadership that understood addiction as a health issue, medical communities engaged in developing solutions, civic organizations willing to advocate for resources, and populations not too damaged by stigma to seek help. These success stories were rare, but proved that meaningful intervention was possible when conditions aligned. The pharmaceutical countermeasures continued evolving as companies reformulated popular codeine medications. New versions included abuse deterrents that made extraction more difficult, or added substances that would cause unpleasant effects if injected. Some formulations combined codeine with opioid antagonists that blocked the high if the medication was misused. Users responded by targeting older formulations still in circulation, or switching to alternative codeine sources. The technological arms race between pharmaceutical designers and street chemists accelerated, with each side adapting to the other's moves in months-long cycles. By late 2013, the regulatory and enforcement efforts had produced measurable but modest effects on Krokodil availability and use. Codeine was harder to obtain in large quantities, raising costs and reducing convenience. Police presence had increased in known production areas, adding risk to cooking operations. Some treatment options had expanded marginally in major cities. The combined impact was enough to begin bending the epidemic curve downward, though whether this represented policy success or simply the natural decline as the most vulnerable users died remained debatable. The crisis was far from over, but the peak had clearly passed. Krokodil remained overwhelmingly a Russian phenomenon despite initial fears that it would spread globally like methamphetamine or MDMA before it. The specific conditions enabling the epidemic, widespread codeine availability, economic desperation, particular cultural attitudes toward drug use, didn't align elsewhere in ways that would support similar outbreaks. Ukraine reported scattered cases beginning around 2010, concentrated in eastern regions with close cultural and economic ties to Russia. The numbers never approached Russian levels because Ukrainian authorities implemented codeine restrictions earlier and more effectively after watching the disaster unfold across the border. Kazakhstan saw limited Krokodil use in cities near the Russian border, where the drug culture naturally crossed over. The Kazakh cases clustered in specific neighborhoods of Pavlodar and Oskamen, where Russian migrants formed significant populations. Local health authorities documented perhaps a few thousand users at peak, a serious problem, but not the mass epidemic consuming Russian cities. The synthesis instructions were available in Kazakh language forums, and the codeine was accessible, yet widespread adoption never materialized. Some combination of different drug market dynamics, stronger family structures, and more effective early intervention prevented the explosive growth seen in Russia. Georgia experienced a brief Krokodil outbreak in Tbilisi around 2012 that generated alarmed media coverage before subsiding. Georgian authorities responded with immediate harsh crackdowns on codeine sales and aggressive prosecution of anyone involved in production. The heavy-handed approach was criticized for trampling civil liberties and medical access, but it did prevent the drug from establishing a permanent foothold. Within 18 months, Krokodil use in Georgia had declined to isolated cases. The success came at a cost. Legitimate pain patients struggled to access medications they genuinely needed, but policymakers accepted this trade-off to avoid Russia's fate. European countries monitored the Krokodil situation anxiously, fearing the drug would arrive with Eastern European migrants or through deliberate trafficking. Scattered individual cases appeared in Germany, Belgium and France between 2011 and 2013, overwhelmingly among expatriate Russian populations. A heroin addict in Berlin synthesized desomorphine using instructions from Russian websites, suffered typical tissue damage, and died within months. Polish authorities arrested several individuals cooking Krokodil in Warsaw, all recent immigrants from Russia or Ukraine. These isolated incidents never sparked local epidemics because the European drug markets operated completely differently from Russia's. The Western European context lacked every factor necessary for Krokodil to flourish. Codeine was tightly controlled, available only by prescription and closely monitored. Heroin remained relatively affordable and available to dependent users, eliminating the economic pressure to find alternatives. Methadone maintenance programs provided legal opioid substitution for addicts seeking treatment. Harm reduction services distributed clean needles and provided medical support. The comprehensive social safety net meant fewer people faced the absolute desperation that drove Russians to inject toxic chemicals. European drug users made rational choices to avoid a substance that offered no advantages over existing options. North America saw even less Krokodil penetration, despite media panic around 2013 suggesting an imminent epidemic. The DEA documented fewer than 10 confirmed cases across the United States between 2010 and 2015, mostly among Russian immigrants. A single case in Arizona generated national headlines wildly disproportionate to the actual threat. The American opioid crisis was exploding during this period, but the trajectory ran through prescription painkillers, heroin, and eventually fentanyl, drugs that provided longer highs and didn't cause immediate visible tissue destruction. American addicts had no incentive to cook Krokodil when Mexican heroin was cheap and plentiful. Canada reported 0 confirmed Krokodil cases through the early 2000s, despite bordering the United States and hosting communities of Eastern European immigrants. Canadian harm reduction policies provided addicts with support systems that made desperate measures unnecessary. The contrast between Canadian and Russian outcomes demonstrated how drug policy choices shaped epidemic patterns. Both countries faced opioid addiction problems, but Canada's treatment-focused approach prevented the specific horror of Krokodil, while Russia's punitive system enabled it. The international medical community studied Krokodil as a cautionary tale about what happens when addiction treatment fails catastrophically. Research papers appeared in toxicology journals analyzing the specific chemical mechanisms causing tissue damage. Case studies documented the clinical presentation and treatment challenges. The scholarly attention came too late to help Russian victims, but created knowledge that would prevent future disasters. Medical schools began including Krokodil in pharmacology curricula as an extreme example of why drug purity and harm reduction matter. International drug policy experts pointed to Krokodil as definitive proof that prohibition alone cannot control substance use. Russia's harsh criminal penalties and aggressive enforcement had accomplished nothing except filling prisons while the epidemic raged. Countries with treatment-focused approaches and harm reduction infrastructure saw minimal problems. The contrast validated decades of public health research suggesting that addressing underlying causes of addiction produced better outcomes than punishment. Russian authorities rejected these conclusions, insisting that insufficient enforcement rather than flawed policy was the problem. The global synthetic drug market was simultaneously evolving in directions that would eventually reduce Krokodil's appeal even in Russia. Chinese chemical manufacturers began producing novel synthetic opioids that were more potent than heroin, easier to smuggle, and didn't require the messy cooking process of Desomorphine. These new substances, fentanyl analogues and other designer opioids, started appearing in Russian drug markets around 2013 and 2014. They offered powerful highs without tissue destruction, making them preferable alternatives for addicts who'd avoided Krokodil due to its visible dangers. Afghan heroin production recovered from the disruptions of the early 2000s, with bumper poppy crops driving prices downward by 2014. The economic pressure that had pushed Russian addicts toward Krokodil eased as heroin became affordable again. Street prices in Russian cities dropped by 30 to 40% between 2013 and 2015. Users who'd switched to Krokodil out of financial necessity could now afford to switch back to heroin. The market dynamics that had created the epidemic were reversing, though not from any deliberate policy success. The combination of tighter codeine controls, heroin price drops, and new synthetic alternatives created a perfect storm that caused Krokodil use to decline sharply, starting in 2013. Regional health departments reported 50 to 70% reductions in new cases between 2013 and 2015. Emergency room admissions for Krokodil-related complications fell dramatically. Pharmacy sales of codeine medications dropped to a fraction of peak levels. The crisis was ending, though not through any single intervention, but rather multiple factors aligning accidentally. The death toll had been staggering by any measure. Conservative estimates suggested 30,000 to 50,000 deaths directly attributable to Krokodil between 2002 and 2015. Less conservative calculations examining excess mortality in affected regions proposed figures upward of 100,000 deaths. The true number would never be known because many users died without reaching medical facilities, were buried without autopsies, or succumbed to complications attributed to other causes. Entire cohorts of young people in Siberian cities had been decimated. The demographic impact would echo for decades. The survivors carried permanent damage that would burden medical systems and disability programs indefinitely. Thousands of amputees required prosthetics, rehabilitation, and ongoing support. Users with chronic organ damage needed long-term treatment for kidney disease, liver dysfunction, and cardiac problems. Brain damage left some with cognitive impairments requiring lifelong care. The economic costs of treating these long-term consequences dwarfed the amount spent on prevention and treatment during the active epidemic. Russian society would be paying for Krokodil's legacy for the next 50 years. Specific regions bore disproportionate costs because the epidemic had concentrated geographically. Irkutsk Oblast, with a population of roughly 2.4 million, probably lost 10 to 15,000 residents to Krokodil over the epidemic's peak years. The city of Omsk experienced similar devastation relative to its population. These areas faced not just mortality, but the loss of young adults in their productive years, the demographic cohort that should have been building careers, starting families, and contributing economically. The missing generation created economic holes that would take decades to fill. The psychological trauma extended beyond users and their families to entire communities forced to witness the horror. Children who grew up in neighborhoods dominated by Krokodil use internalized that trauma in ways that would affect their development permanently. Medical professionals who treated hundreds of Krokodil cases suffered PTSD and burnout. First responders who repeatedly encountered users in various states of decay became psychologically damaged. The collective trauma in affected communities resembled that of war zones, though the destruction came from within rather than external attack. International public health organizations attempted to extract lessons that might prevent similar disasters elsewhere. The World Health Organization published reports analyzing the epidemic's causes and progression. Academic researchers from multiple countries contributed to a growing body of literature on synthetic drug epidemics in post-Soviet contexts. The consensus emphasized that Krokodil resulted from policy failures across multiple domains: pharmaceutical regulation, addiction treatment, economic development, social support systems. Preventing future epidemics required addressing all these factors simultaneously rather than focusing narrowly on supply reduction. The media attention that had brought Krokodil to international awareness began fading as case numbers declined. Western journalists moved on to other shocking stories. The viral images and videos that had horrified viewers in 2012 and 2013 became historical artifacts of a crisis past its peak. This attention shift was premature because Krokodil hadn't disappeared entirely. It had merely declined from epidemic to endemic levels. Users in specific communities continued cooking and injecting, dying slower deaths that no longer warranted headlines. Russian cultural memory of the epidemic remained confused and contested. State media narratives emphasized law enforcement successes in controlling the drug while minimizing the scope of the disaster. Independent journalists and activists who documented the crisis faced harassment or were dismissed as exaggerating for political purposes. Families affected by Krokodil deaths often remained silent due to stigma. The result was collective amnesia about an event that had killed more Russians than many recognized wars. The failure to honestly reckon with what happened guaranteed that lessons wouldn't be learned or applied to prevent future crises. The specific synthesis knowledge had become permanently embedded in Russian drug culture and could resurge if conditions changed. The recipes remained available on archived forums and in the memories of survivors. If codeine controls loosened or heroin prices spiked again, Krokodil could return quickly. This latent threat meant that the public health infrastructure needed to remain vigilant, monitoring pharmacy sales, maintaining treatment capacity, watching for early warning signs. The tendency toward complacency after crises fade created vulnerability to resurgence. By 2015, the Krokodil epidemic had definitively entered its decline phase, though the decline was neither complete nor irreversible. Estimates suggested perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 active users remained nationally, down from peak estimates of several hundred thousand. These remaining users were concentrated in specific geographic pockets where the drug culture was most entrenched. The scattered persistence meant that emergency rooms in affected cities still admitted Krokodil cases regularly, just not in the overwhelming numbers of the peak years. Medical staff maintained the specialised knowledge required to treat these patients because the need hadn't disappeared entirely. The year 2026 finds Krokodil reduced to a ghost, haunting the margins of Russian drug culture. Occasional media reports surface about isolated cases in remote Siberian towns or impoverished urban neighbourhoods, but the mass epidemic has conclusively ended. Current estimates place active users in the hundreds rather than hundreds of thousands, scattered across a nation of 144 million people. The drug persists in the collective consciousness more powerfully than in actual use, a nightmare that seems incomprehensible now that it's past. Yet the mechanisms that created the epidemic remain fundamentally unchanged, waiting for the right conditions to generate the next disaster. The survivors of Krokodil addiction occupy a unique category of medical patients requiring specialized long-term care. Hundreds of bilateral amputees navigate Russian society without legs, their stumps testament to injections that destroyed tissue faster than surgeons could cut. Upper limb amputees number in the thousands, many missing both arms below the elbow or living with single functional hands. The prosthetics available through Russian state healthcare are basic at best, leaving most survivors with limited mobility and chronic pain. Phantom limb syndrome plagues amputees who feel excruciating sensations in body parts that no longer exist, a cruel reminder of what Krokodil took from them. Organ damage among survivors creates ongoing medical crises that will persist until death. Kidney transplant waiting lists include dozens of former Krokodil users suffering end-stage renal disease from years of toxic exposure. Dialysis centres in affected regions treat permanent patient populations whose kidneys will never recover. Liver cirrhosis from chemical damage progresses slowly but inevitably toward failure. The cardiovascular damage, destroyed heart valves, damaged vessels, pulmonary hypertension, guarantees shortened lifespans even for those who successfully stopped using. A former Krokodil addict who quit in 2013 and survived might live to 50 if fortunate, dying decades earlier than natural life expectancy. The neurological impairment ranges from subtle to catastrophic, depending on exposure duration and individual factors. Some survivors show mild cognitive deficits, slightly slower processing, mild memory problems, executive function challenges that make employment difficult. Others suffered strokes from septic emboli that left them with paralysis, speech impairments, or seizure disorders requiring lifelong medication. The brain damage is permanent and progressive in cases where ongoing inflammation continues destroying neurons years after the last injection. Dementia appears prematurely in survivors barely into their 40s, their brains aged decades beyond their chronological years. Social marginalization ensures that Krokodil survivors remain isolated from mainstream society even after quitting. The visible scars, missing limbs, facial deformities, extensive skin grafts, mark them immediately as former users. employment discrimination is universal and legal under Russian law, which provides minimal protection for recovering addicts. Housing discrimination forces many survivors into the same poor neighborhoods where they used, surrounded by reminders and temptations. The social death complements the physical destruction, creating lives worth living only through extraordinary resilience and support systems that rarely materialize. Russian addiction treatment has evolved marginally in Krokodil's wake, though nowhere near the comprehensive reform the crisis demanded. A few pilot programs testing medication-assisted treatment with buprenorphine launched in Moscow and St. Petersburg around 2020, serving tiny patient populations. Methadone remains illegal despite overwhelming international evidence of its effectiveness. The dominant treatment philosophy still emphasizes abstinence and willpower, rather than medical intervention and harm reduction. The system that failed to prevent Krokodil continues failing new generations of opioid users facing fentanyl and synthetic drugs, more potent than anything available during the epidemic's peak. Pharmaceutical regulation tightened permanently around codeine and related substances, creating the one clear policy legacy of the epidemic. Over-the-counter codeine sales are now impossible in Russia. All opioid medications require prescriptions with strict documentation and monitoring. Pharmacies face severe penalties for violations, making them vigilant gatekeepers rather than passive vendors. The black market adapted by smuggling prescription opioids or importing precursor chemicals for synthetic drug production. The regulatory success in controlling codeine simply redirected demand towards substances even more dangerous, demonstrating the futility of supply-side interventions without addressing underlying addiction. Economic conditions in the regions hardest hit by Krokodil have deteriorated further since the epidemic's peak, guaranteeing that new drug crises will emerge. Siberian industrial cities continue hollowing out as young people flee westward seeking opportunities. Unemployment and underemployment dominate local economies built around factories that closed decades ago. The despair and hopelessness that made Krokodil's brief escape attractive persist unaddressed. Current drug problems involve synthetic cannabinoids, fentanyl analogues, and designer stimulants, a rotating cast of substances filling the same psychological void that Krokodil occupied. The drugs change, but the desperation remains constant. International drug policy debates reference Krokodil as the ultimate cautionary tale, though the lessons drawn vary wildly depending on political perspective. Prohibitionists cite it as proof that dangerous drugs require harsh enforcement to prevent epidemics. Harm reduction advocates point to it as definitive evidence that criminalization without treatment creates the worst possible outcomes. Both sides cherry-pick facts supporting their positions while ignoring inconvenient data. The reality that Krokodil resulted from multiple policy failures across domains – healthcare, economics, social services, regulation – gets lost in simplified narratives designed to advance particular agendas. The scientific literature on Krokodil has grown substantially since 2015, as researchers analysed archived data and tracked long-term outcomes. Toxicology papers detailed exactly which synthesis byproducts caused which types of tissue damage, creating understanding that came too late to save lives but might prevent future disasters. Epidemiological studies mapped the geographic spread and identified demographic risk factors with precision impossible during the chaos of the active epidemic. Medical journals published long-term follow-up studies of survivors, documenting the permanent health consequences. This knowledge sits in academic libraries and medical databases, available but largely ignored by policymakers who could use it. The comparison between Krokodil and the Western opioid crisis reveals both parallels and stark differences in how drug epidemics develop. Both situations involved pharmaceutical opioids as initial substances, before users escalated to more dangerous alternatives. Both demonstrated how economic desperation and lack of treatment access drive addiction. The crucial difference was that Western addicts switched from prescription pills to heroin and fentanyl, dangerous but professionally manufactured, while Russians switched to a homemade poison they cooked in bathrooms. The variation in outcomes reflected differences in drug market sophistication and harm reduction infrastructure. North America's fentanyl crisis surpassed Krokodil in total deaths. 100,000 Americans died of overdoses in 2021 alone, but the manner of death differed fundamentally. Fentanyl users died suddenly from respiratory depression, often unaware they'd consumed a lethal dose. Krokodil users died slowly from infections and organ failure, watching their bodies decompose over months. The psychological horror of Krokodil exceeded fentanyl's body count, though both crises demonstrated how opioid addiction devastates communities when society fails to respond effectively. The global lesson was that addiction required public health solutions rather than criminal justice responses, a lesson most nations continued ignoring. China's role in supplying precursor chemicals for synthetic drugs worldwide created new vulnerabilities that could enable crocodile-like substances to emerge elsewhere. Chinese pharmaceutical companies manufactured and exported thousands of novel compounds with minimal oversight, shipping them globally to anyone with money and an address. Some of these compounds were toxic opioid analogues that could cause tissue damage similar to Krokodil if injected improperly. The decentralized global chemical market meant that the knowledge and materials for creating dangerous synthetic drugs were universally available, waiting only for economic conditions desperate enough to make their use attractive. Russian civil society organizations working on drug policy reform used Krokodil as evidence that fundamental change was necessary, though progress remained glacial. Activist groups documented the epidemic through preserved testimonials, photographs, and statistical analysis, creating an historical record the government preferred to forget. These organizations advocated for harm reduction programs, treatment expansion, and decriminalization of drug use. The efforts achieved minor victories, a few needle exchange programs, limited treatment funding increases, but nothing approaching the systemic reform required. Political opposition from conservative elements and law enforcement lobbies blocked meaningful change. The families who lost children to Krokodil largely remained silent publicly, processing their grief privately rather than organizing for policy change. Shame and stigma prevented most from speaking openly about addiction's role in their tragedies. The few parents who did become activists faced harassment and social ostracism for advocating that addicts deserve treatment rather than punishment. This silence allowed the government to minimize the epidemic's scope and avoid accountability for policy failures. Without vocal survivors demanding change, the political will to reform the system never materialized. Medical professionals who treated Krokodil patients during the epidemic's peak suffered psychological damage that affected their careers permanently. Surgeon burnout rates in affected regions soared as doctors performed amputations on patients they knew would return for more amputations until death. Emergency medicine specialists developed PTSD from repeated exposure to suffering they couldn't alleviate. Many left medicine entirely, unable to continue working in a system that failed so catastrophically. The human cost extended beyond users and families to the healthcare workers forced to witness industrialized death. The cultural mythology around Krokodil grew increasingly distorted as the actual epidemic faded into memory. Urban legends claimed users turned literally into zombies, or that the drug caused cannibalism, complete fabrications based on sensationalized media coverage. Young Russians in 2026 heard about Krokodil as a horror story from the recent past, barely believing such a thing could have existed. The mythologizing served to distance contemporary society from the crisis, making it seem like an aberration rather than the predictable result of policy choices. This psychological distancing prevented learning the lessons that might prevent future epidemics. The geographic concentration of Krokodil's impact created regional trauma that transcended individual users and families. Entire neighborhoods in Siberian cities lost substantial portions of their young adult populations to death or disability. Schools in affected areas graduated classes where 20 or 30% of students were already addicted or would become addicted within years. The concentrated trauma resembled that of communities experiencing war or natural disasters, though the destruction was self-inflicted and preventable. Recovery required not just individual healing, but collective rebuilding of social fabric torn apart by mass death. Current Russian drug policy shows minimal evidence of having learned from Krokodil beyond the narrow codeine restrictions. Law enforcement still dominates the official response to drug problems, with billions spent on interdiction and incarceration while treatment receives token funding. Harm reduction remains controversial and limited. The punitive approach that failed to prevent Krokodil continues failing against current drug challenges. Synthetic opioids designed in Chinese laboratories and smuggled through mail systems present problems that enforcement cannot solve. Yet enforcement remains the primary tool deployed. The ultimate lesson of Krokodil: that addiction is a health problem requiring medical solutions, has been rejected by Russian authorities in favor of maintaining a war on drugs approach that consistently fails. This rejection guarantees that future drug crises will follow similar trajectories of denial, inadequate response, and mass casualties before any effective intervention materializes. The pattern has repeated with synthetic cannabinoids, designer stimulants, and fentanyl analogues in the years since Krokodil's decline. Each new epidemic runs through predictable phases: emergence, denial, panic, harsh enforcement, eventual subsidence, then repetition with a new substance. The international community largely forgot Krokodil once media attention shifted elsewhere, losing interest when the epidemic was no longer generating shocking photographs and viral videos. The brief window when global health organizations and foreign governments offered assistance closed as Russia's defensive nationalism and the world's short attention span combined to isolate the problem. By 2026, Krokodil is remembered internationally as a bizarre historical curiosity rather than a preventable public health disaster that killed tens of thousands. The amnesia ensures that when similar conditions emerge elsewhere, the hard-won knowledge from Russia's experience won't inform responses. The few researchers who continue studying Krokodil's long-term impacts do so with minimal funding and limited access to survivors who've dispersed or died. The longitudinal studies that could provide crucial data about recovery trajectories and persistent health problems struggle to maintain contact with patient populations. What could be a rich data set informing addiction medicine globally instead remains fragmentary and incomplete. The lost opportunity to generate systematic knowledge from the epidemic represents another failure: the inability to extract even academic value from mass suffering. The Desomorphine synthesis knowledge remains permanently available through archived websites and the memories of those who learned it. Instructions detailed enough for anyone with basic chemistry understanding to follow exist in Russian, English, and multiple other languages across the internet. No amount of censorship or content removal can eliminate this information now that it's widely distributed. The genie cannot be returned to the bottle. If economic conditions in Russia or elsewhere create sufficient desperation, Krokodil or similar homemade drugs could emerge again within months. The knowledge waits dormant, ready to cause new catastrophes when circumstances align. The final accounting of Krokodil's toll extends beyond mortality statistics to encompass everything the epidemic revealed about Russian society and global drug policy. It exposed the brutality of addiction when treatment infrastructure is absent. It demonstrated how economic desperation drives people to self-destruction when alternatives vanish. It proved that prohibition alone cannot control drug use and often worsens outcomes. It showed that harm reduction and treatment work better than punishment and interdiction. Every one of these lessons was already known from decades of international research and experience. Krokodil simply provided another bloody confirmation of facts that policymakers worldwide continue to ignore. The dead are gone. The survivors endure. The system that killed them remains fundamentally unchanged, waiting to generate the next preventable disaster.